singing tonight. Great to hear the praises and thanksgiving. And I know there are more than that. And it's good to take recognition that we have grateful hearts. And it is a sacrifice to give thanksgiving. It costs you. You have to use some energy, and think. Well, tonight we are continuing on in the 7th lesson in the book of Judges, and we're beginning, I won't say ending, but we're beginning with Judges chapter 3 and verse 31, where it says, "And after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel." Now, there's just not a lot about Shamgar. But we can kind of look at the listing, and we learn that Othniel was number 1, and Ehud was number 2, and then number 3 is Shamgar. Now, it's kind of interesting because this is the only verse that you have on him, and he's really kind of one of those that are considered a minor judge. But a minor judge in the same way that you have minor prophets. They're just smaller. There's not a lot of information on them. So there's only one other verse that gives us any information about him, and that is about in the days of Shamgar, that if we were to look after, again, we learn after him was Shamgar, the son of Anath, which slew the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel. And then in the days of Shamgar, and that's in the song of Deborah, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were unoccupied, and the travelers walked through the byways. That is a status of Israel's culture and safety and justice. And you'd have to go to the next verse where then you find out it says, "Until I rose up." I guess I'm going to get to that verse if it's there. I guess it's not. So I guess I didn't put it in there. But in verse 7 it says, "The inhabitants of the villages ceased. They ceased in Israel until that I, Deborah, arose." That I arose, a mother in Israel. Again, it's interesting because as you look through this, Shamgar, the more that you read and look through this, it's like Shamgar is really just kind of a blip on the screen. He's a judge that delivered Israel in a unique situation with the Philistines, but it's almost as if he's just there for a moment, but he doesn't seem to give any kind of peace to Israel for whatever time he may have been the judge of Israel. And it could have been, again, that during that time of 18 years that we read about, because with Deborah and the oppression that was on Israel, because the notation is made in chapter 4 and verse 1, and we'll look at that a little bit later, but it talks about going right from Ehud, when he died, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So really there's not much mention of anything other than just Shamgar, what he did to the 600 Philistines, and that he delivered Israel, and that's pretty much it. The enemies of Israel were known and really were tolerated, or they weren't dealt with in a just manner. The foreign nations that had invaded them had marauders, in particular the Philistines, who seemed to rob people on the regular highways or their routes of main travel. And they even entered into the unwalled villages and looted the homes or attacked the villagers. This tells us that in the days of Shamgar, justice was not carried out. And that's one of the things that's central to the judges and their particular reign. Safety of the villages, the towns, and the highways, and the people who lived in them or nearby them or traveled on them were in jeopardy during this time. Moral problems seemed to still exist. Crime was rampant and went unpunished. Even though it says that he delivered Israel from the Philistines, he didn't deliver Israel from Israel. That's kind of what you get the picture of. Not every judge that you read about was a good one spiritually or morally. I just draw your attention to Eli. Eli was a judge over Israel, and yet he had his corrupt sons who literally slept with women who 1 Samuel says in 2:22 that they, with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So they made it corrupt. And their corruption caused the people of Israel to abhor the offering of the Lord. So their character, their corrupt moral character, caused Israel to have difficulties with the whole worship of God. And then in 1 Samuel 14:18 it says, it came to pass again when he had made mention of the ark of God that he fell from off the seat backward by the side of the gate, and his neck brake, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. That's the only place you're going to note that he was a judge. But he wasn't a very good one. I'm not saying that Shamgar was corrupt, but his short-lived time as a judge and the characterization of the days of Shamgar tell us something. We also know that Jael is mentioned. Jael, of course, is a woman of strong character who helped deliver Israel under Deborah. We know already, and we'll get to it a little bit later, that she nailed Sisera's head to the ground. And yet she is not listed as a judge. Some people will say that Barak was also a judge, but there's no mention of him being a judge. She, instead, was the noted individual, and people would remember her time and place in the history of Israel. Now, if we're going to look at just briefly the outline, we're going to look at the judge again, the children of Israel, the oppressor, the chronology, and the application. And I'm going to almost preach all of Shamgar in this one outline, again, because there's not a lot about him. Shamgar, we don't find any particular meaning to his name, although Strong says his name means sword. We don't even know what tribe that he came from. We have no idea. He's not even called a judge. It is not even said that God raised him up or that peace was given to Israel during or after his time of judgment. We'll look at that a little bit later too. Some, in fact, will say that he wasn't an Israelite. I think that he was an Israelite. I think that we don't, even though we don't know anything about him, his father was Anath. We don't know who that is. We don't know anything about him. Some say his name comes from a false goddess. Some say that his parents were of mixed marriage. But all of that is guessing. That's all it is. Again, Shamgar was a short-lived judge who did not give Israel overall peace during his rule. He defeated the Philistines with unusual weaponry, and he delivered Israel from their rule. But he did not provide a just culture in which Israel could live in peace. We see that because of what Deborah says in her song. But he does appear to be adaptable or flexible. He's not a rigid or hard-ruling person. And it appears that, again, he may have, just been a farmer of some sort, because he used a very unusual weapon, an ox goad, to kill some 600 Philistines. Well, the ox goad, again, may tell us a little bit about where he worked, what he did. And an ox goad, you know what that is. It's just simply a long stick pointed on one end, oftentimes cupped on the other end like it would be a hoe on the other end, but it's a long stick that they used to move oxen around, that they poked them. There was a prick that was there. Well, he must have had some skill in being able to do that, and I know that God enabled him That's what really made the difference there. But it's just very different that God would use his natural skill in such a time as this. The children of Israel, though no mention is made of their cycle until we get to chapter 4, we can safely assume that that applies to the time before him, after Ehud, and that it talks about after Ehud, they had done the same thing, that they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And God then raised up the Philistines, though again, we don't read that either. But you have to assume the cycle is consistent in the scriptures. And the Philistines were used by God to chasten Israel for their wicked idolatry. Again, we don't even read about Israel crying out to God. We only read Shamgar kind of almost as an addendum to Ehud. And after him was Shamgar. That's it. And after him was Shamgar. Well, who were the oppressors? They were the Philistines. We are probably very familiar with the Philistines and their conflict over and over again with Israel. They were a people who migrated to the land of Philistia. Some will say they were originally Canaanites. In Zephaniah 2 and 5, it says, O Canaan, the land of the Philistines. Or this could simply mean that they were a people who traded, who moved, but settled in Philistia. But we don't really know. There's a lot of speculation about their particular origin. We do know the word Philistine or Philistines is found some 541 times in the Old Testament, and we all know that they have a long history with Israel. In fact, we know that David lived there for a while. Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines, and during this time of the Judges, we've already encountered the 5 lords of the Philistines in Joshua chapter 3, and Judges chapter 3 and verse 3, as well as back in Joshua chapter 13 and verse 3. They are noticed as a warring and very aggressive people. If you remember when God led Israel out of Egypt, he led them, it says, the long way around. He didn't lead them the short way, because that would have taken them through the land of Philistia. And it says that God was protecting them lest they would see war and feel defeated or have a problem with that. So must have been a warring people. Moses' song, even after the destruction of Pharaoh and his army, includes a promise of victory over the inhabitants of Palestina. It's found in Exodus 15 and verse 14. And of course, though future, we all know about the most famous Philistine that we could name in the popular story of David and Goliath. They were notorious for expanding their territory and conquering other nations for their riches. And it happens to be that one of these expansions took place after the death of Ehud, when God used them, and of course it ended during the rule of the judge Shamgar. The chronology, nothing is known at all. We're not even certain of his timing, other than what we can learn from reading Judges 5 and 7, which places him prior to Deborah. And that's the only thing that you're going to learn. You don't know how long he lasted. You don't know how long any of that, unless you were to place him in the same category as Deborah, which is 18 years of oppression and 40 years of peace. But those 40 years of peace don't belong to Shamgar. So there was a disruption of time while he was there until Deborah showed up. And when I look at the application, we learn that enemies are from without and from within. They, of course, Israel, needed to be rescued from the Philistines and from the robbers and thieves. Their ability to carry out commerce was interrupted. Their ability to travel was confined and restricted basically to the back roads. It was an unsafe environment, and even their farming and commerce were disturbed, and in some cases eliminated. In other words, their problem affected every area of their lives. That's the application. When we're not walking with the Lord, when we're not doing right with him and where he wants us to be, every area of our lives is affected by it. We can't just sit there and think that just one little area, just our spiritual part of our lives is going to be affected. No, it affects much more. We also can learn that deliverance doesn't always come through a perfect tool. Shamgar, I would think, was not a perfect tool, though he proved to be adaptive and flexible. And I say that because he didn't use a sword or a spear. He didn't even use a bow and arrow. He just simply used an ox goad. But his deliverance was decisive and quick, and it was magnifying, really, the glory of God. And the fact, again, that we must mortify the deeds of the flesh and move on to defeat the enemies of darkness. Now, I said earlier that when speaking about Shamgar, the judge, he's not called a judge, but God raised him up. And there was no peace that was given to Israel during his particular time, but only when Deborah showed up. In fact, when we move on, and we will, to the story of Deborah, the next judge, it starts out with, and we're going to look at that just a little bit, but Shamgar, I should give you, they were out of order. He was raised up by God, he was empowered by God, and he was adaptable or flexible. Well, that's something that we ought to be as well. We also see when we begin to look about, again, Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and now Deborah. And I won't say Deborah and Barak, even though they're combined in the story, but her story goes from chapter 4, verse 1, all the way to chapter 5 and verse 31. So you can tell we're not going to get to the end of the story. We may not even get to the end of this chapter. We've got a few minutes left, but we are going to at least read the first 4 and get introduced to Deborah as the next judge. In chapter 4 and verse 1, we learn a little bit again about her culture, where she was at, what was going on. And all of the judges, you have to understand, every one of them find themselves in this same culture. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord when Ehud was dead. Again, that's the only way we know what happened with Shamgar also. And that's where we can assume that God raised up the Philistines and he delivered them through Shamgar. But it really is giving us the story through Deborah. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord when Ehud was dead. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. Now we've got a different oppressor. A king of Canaan that reigned in Hazor, the captain of whose host was Sisera, which dwelt in Harosheth of the Gentiles. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel. So we can see the 20 years, the chronology that's here. And then verse 4 is Deborah's calling. And Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, she judged Israel at that time. Deborah, again, just kind of makes Shamgar kind of a simple footnote. Again, no mention is made of Shamgar's death or his ruling as a judge, only of Ehud. It's like Ehud, this guy, and then Deborah. That's it. You don't see a whole lot of it. The might of the enemy is portrayed in this section as having 900 chariots of iron and having ruled over Israel or oppressed them mightily for 20 years. Now, when we begin to look at all of those together, that 900 chariots tells us, and chariots of iron, tells us that they were mechanically advanced as far as their army is concerned. They had a trained, mighty army. They had the weaponry. And what did you see with Shamgar? An ox goad. That's a little out of line and out of balance, isn't it? But what we're going to learn is Deborah is going to command Barak to go up and fight for God because he has delivered them into your hands. Might be a little bit of a shock to him, but many do diminish Barak's acts in this story because he didn't want to go by himself. He wanted to take her with him, and so they diminish him a little bit. But before you do that, I remind you that he is mentioned in the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Even though he is not given the details, the writer there says, and time doesn't allow me to tell you, and he mentions Barak along with Gideon, Samson, and Japheth, which are all judges during this particular time. Now, if I were to give you a little bit more of this particular, the judge, of course, is Deborah, and we'll get into her a little bit more next week. But the children of Israel, we know exactly what we just read there. They did evil in the sight of the Lord. The oppressor here, not the Philistines so much, but we also notice that the Philistines were kind of the ones who held on to Canaan. So there's some connection that's there. But Jabin, king of the Canaanites, former king of Hazor, who also fought with Joshua and lost. And you can read that in Joshua chapter 11, verses 10 through 15. And it's there and here in particular that his rule is going to be utterly destroyed. We read that at the end of the chapter. The chronology, again, is how long they were oppressed. They enjoyed peace for 40 years. And then the application that we'll look at gives us multiple lessons. Again, we won't look at that tonight except to learn a little bit about cooperation, coordination, commendation, appreciation, and recognition. When we look at the judge in particular, we're talking about, of course, Deborah. Her name is often associated with the word that has to do with be. Seems that she was a busy, industrious. That's why the word be, possibly. We know that she was married. We don't know about children. We know that she had a home and where she lived. We know that she was married to a fellow by the name of Lapidoth. That's the only mention in all of the Bible. And his name apparently means torches or have something to do with light. You can make of that what you will. A lot of commentaries do. Surprising how many people will write about the meaning of a name and then give you a whole list about this person. It's all speculation. The one thing we're not speculating about is she was a prophetess. Now, she foretold, in other words, things that were to come, but those things that she foretold were from the Lord. I think this might be also spoken in retrospect of what she said about Israel. If you want to go through, you look at verses 6 and 7, verse 9, verse 14, primarily having to do with her song in chapter 5, where she is singing about all of those things that she had talked about before and told Barak about. There were other women prophetesses in the Bible. If you remember, Miriam, the sister to Moses and Aaron, was also called a prophetess. Huldah was called a prophetess. Noai was also called a prophetess. And in the New Testament, Anna was called a prophetess. And it is by her word that Barak is moved to fight against Sisera and destroy King Jabin, that Canaanite who ruled over Hazor. She's also persuasive. How is that so? Because she persuaded Barak to go. This is what the Lord told you to do. You need to go do it. Now, just because you're told that the Lord said go do this from somebody else, it doesn't mean that you're always going to listen to him. Any more than a lot of people did in the Bible. The Lord has told many people what to do by a prophet or a prophetess, and they failed to comply with what God told them. But she was persuasive, and he did do what she said, but he made a deal with her, and that's where you're going to see that she was also powerful, because Barak is not called a judge, but Deborah is. She is making the decisions And she is the power behind that duet of both her and Barak. She is the one who is raised up by God to deliver them, even though the tool was Barak in that physical encounter. But even with then, she is the one that judged Israel and would convince them of their sin. She is the one who would encourage them and convince them to confess their sin, to be converted from their sin, and then to conform themselves to the Word of God and in their culture and their system of justice. Things changed under this woman. She was the one that God used to administer judgment and justice for 40 years. She was also poetic. Both Deborah and Barak are noted as singing the song in chapter 5. But it is called the Song of Deborah. And it will be our subject next week when we get into it. And it gives us the best details of the victory over the Canaanites, Caesarea, and King Jabin. When we begin to look at the whole story, the children of Israel again, there's just no question about what they did. The cycle is there. They did evil. They were sold by God to the enemy, chastened, oppressed for 18 years, cried unto the Lord, saved by God through a deliverer, and then given peace for some 40 years. Then when we look at the chronology again, oppressed 18 years, peace for 40 years. Then the application of it, I already talked about the cooperation, the coordination, the commendation, appreciation, and the recognition. We'll get into that as we go through a little bit more because of the cooperation that she made between her and Barak and between the tribes of Ephraim and Naphtali. The coordination of when to do, what to do, and where to do their attack was laid out. The commendation is that she didn't, when he finally agreed to do what he was going to do, yeah, I'll go if you'll go with me. What did she do? She said, okay, I'll go with you, but you're not going to get the glory out of this. A woman's going to get the glory out of this. And then the story comes out exactly what happens. The appreciation, well, we'll get into it as we go a little bit further along. Let's look at Deborah's calling in verse 4. And Deborah, again, we already read it, but a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, she judged Israel at that time. Again, this appears to be her place of judgment. It makes it appear that she was a very industrious woman and well known. She had a place where the people would come to. We'll see that when we read a little bit further, but in verse 5, let's go ahead and look at that. And she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now, if you'll read after Samuel, Samuel had different places that he'd traveled to. Deborah had one place and where she was at, and Israel came to her. She was qualified by God to judge Israel, and that means that they respected her. All the matters of controversy that they couldn't settle themselves by mutual agreement were brought before Deborah, and she satisfied the needs of the justice and judgment. She was well known and well used by Israel, so she was busy with this spiritual venture in leading Israel during this time. Deborah's counsel, verse 6, and this has to do again with the story that we just mentioned. She sent and called Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh Naphtali, and said unto him, Hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded, saying, Go and draw toward Mount Tabor, and take with thee 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and of the children of Zebulun? We know what tribe both Deborah and Barak were from, and they were not from the same tribe, but it appears that she chose the captain of the armed forces and gave him this portion and purpose. And he was to call out 10,000 men from these two tribes. Whether he was to do that by a trumpet or messengers, we do not know, because there's no note of what he did as far as calling them, but it would appear it's possible that both utilities were used as far as the trumpet and messengers. But it was a signal calling them to war, to gather them, to send them into battle. Her counsel, of course, came from the Lord. And she was given specific, very specific instructions on how, when, where that they were to attack. She seems to be noting a very personal call that possibly had already dealt with Barak's heart when she says, "Hath not the Lord God of Israel commanded?" In other words, haven't you already heard this command? In other words, it's kind of like she's tapping into, I already know that God spoke to your heart. I already know that God called you. So isn't this the truth, Barak, that God has already moved upon you to do this? And she spoke to him that he would be a confirmation of that call and then be convinced of that call. Verse 7, I will draw unto thee, this is why I said it's very specific, I will draw unto thee to the river Kishon, Sisera, the captain of Jabin's army, with his chariots, remember those, and his multitude, and I will deliver him into thine hand. Barak then, we know, and was even told that he would face chariots of iron, and he would face a larger force than his own. I can only assume that even though he was calling up 10,000 men, when it says there was a multitude, it's way more than 10,000. So, he's told about a superior armament and a superior army. But he's also given the prophecy of victory. But it's not going to come without a fight. So that's the thing that's there. You've got victory. And I'll make this application for us because we're running out of time here for tonight. You're promised victory. Every one of us are in Jesus Christ. But that victory doesn't come without a fight for you. We have to fight against the flesh, and we have to fight against the powers of darkness, the rulers of darkness. So it was there. Now, I will give you at least one more verse in Deborah's condition. This goes a little bit further than just here. But Barak said unto her, if thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. Now, you give a lot of comment to this. You're not going to go after you've heard that the Lord commanded you to go? You're going to make a condition? So she gave a condition. Or I could say, she'll go, but there's a limitation. Verse 9. And she said, I will surely go with thee, notwithstanding the journey that thou takest, all that you're going to have to do, all the hard work that you're going to go through, all the traveling that you're going to make, shall not be for thine honor. Now, isn't that odd? Because we do read about his name in Hebrews chapter 11. We do read about him here. But still, it is that one account when you read through this story. And all of a sudden, as he's chasing on horseback and whatever else that they might be doing, but they're chasing after Sisera, and he comes in and slides out of his chariot, and she, the woman, runs up and tells him, I got something to show you. Come look. I can show you the man you're chasing. Shows him in their tent, and he's there dead, nailed to the ground. That's it. He had no glory in that battle at all. Was this all because Barak showed weak faith? I don't necessarily know, because he's in chapter 11. She tells Barak that he will accomplish all, but it will be to the honor of a woman and not to himself. And now I'm going to stop there, because then we can get into what takes place that he calls Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and they went up with 10,000 men, and Deborah went up with him, but we'll get into that next week. But this is just kind of a introduction almost to Deborah, with already you've probably forgotten the third judge, Shamgar. Because like I said, he's just a little small notation. That's all he is. But he is after Ehud, then comes Shamgar. But